Me lords and ladies, prithee, hearken to the history of the Middle Ages. Yes, so today we're going to talk about the Middle Ages, including what we kind of consider to be the Ages, the Carolingian Renaissance, and the up to what we call the High Middle Ages. And look, as an introduction to the Middle Ages, I am presenting you some of the best and most sophisticated artwork from the period. This is the Bayeux Tapestry, used to celebrate the Norman invasion and conquest of England in 1066. Just look at all that detail. Ooh. Ah. Okay, so if you're an art critic, maybe you're less than impressed by the level of detail, but that in itself kind of says something. What you're going to find is that the Dark Ages aren't quite so dark, but we do have to concede that the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages in general represent sort of a shift away from the Mediterranean Hellenic culture that we saw during the height of the Roman Empire. Now, the term the Middle Ages is used to describe this period between the collapse of Roman, or what we could kind of call classical civilization, and its reemergence in this period of rebirth called the Renaissance. So you have basically the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476, and by the time you get to the Renaissance, you're looking at the 1300s at the earliest, and really by about the 1400s, we can say that we're in sort of the middle of the Renaissance. So, general overview of some of the things you're going to see in the Middle Ages. So, this is something that's not actually in the bullet point list. The bullet point list is long enough. We begin to see a shift away from the Mediterranean and classical world of the Roman Empire and the establishment of a Europe under with the basis of it being Christendom. There's this, like, Europe is not only a geographical idea, not only is it a continent, the idea is that Europe is kind of more or less the land of the Christians. And of course, with the emergence of Islam, that sort of cements that concept. So we have the early Middle Ages. This is sometimes called the Dark Ages, and it is a period of decline, backwardness, and vulnerability. But let's sort of talk about why you see this decline. Really, you see this decline because of successive invasions by Germanic groups and the Huns. And this leads to the collapse of trade within the Mediterranean world, and especially a collapse of trade within the western part of the Mediterranean world, which includes modern-day Spain, France, Italy, and Great Britain. So the collapse of this trade means that sustaining large urban centers like Rome becomes very, very difficult. People start retreating from the cities into the countryside, and the thing is that when you lose cities, you lose a lot of other things that cities make possible, like institutions of learning, like in many cases, organized religion, like, specialized marketplaces and trades and those sorts of things. So you see a decline in urban living, you see, and that leads to kind of this decline of almost everything else. People become more rural. People become much more isolated in their communities, villages, and farms. The High Middle Ages that we will get to a little bit later, we associate with, Western Europe basically catching up with where the Roman Empire left off in terms of its development, its level of sort of scientific and mathematical understanding. So, a couple of developments that we see in the Middle Ages, both the early Middle Ages to a certain extent and the High Middle Ages to a greater extent, is this is when Europe and Christianity start to sort of be associated as a package deal. At the beginning of the Middle Ages, so we're talking about the Dark Ages, like right around the collapse of the Roman Empire, Europe wasn't necessarily entirely Christian, especially the further north and the further east you go, that Christian identity was less apparent. But by the time you get to the High Middle Ages, Europe and Christianity are like peanut butter and jelly, basically. You see a change in relationship between the West and other regions. I didn't come up with that line. I'm not really sure what that means. I think what that probably means is that you see the Western European states go from being kind of an afterthought, because they really were an afterthought in the Roman Empire, to becoming gradually more centralized states. At the sort of midpoint of the Dark Ages, Europe is still like, just because the Roman Empire collapses, the Western Roman Empire collapses, that does not mean that the end of barbarian invasions was at hand. You still have waves of invaders, specifically Germanic invaders, and of course invaders from what is modern day Scandinavia, the Vikings. And they're actually a critical component in understanding the emergence of this other thing that you probably already know about the Middle Ages, which is feudalism. You do have gradual contact with the Byzantines and the Arabs through the Crusades, and this teaches Western Europeans to math and also teaches them science and philosophy. We'll go into that just a little bit. So the first thing to know about the Dark Ages is, again, you have a collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, but you don't have a collapse of the systems that made the Roman Empire work. So towards the end of the Roman Empire, you began to see this shift towards a system called the latifundia. The latifundia are these massive plantations that grow crops using basically a primitive form of like serfdom, where you have individuals who aren't slaves, because Christianity makes slavery very gauche, very unacceptable, but they do give up some of their basic rights in exchange for food and protection. Basically, the latifundia system was preserved in what we call manorialism. Manorialism is this organization between landlords and these peasant laborers called serfs. Now, it's easy to kind of think of serfs as being slaves, and it's very true that serfs had fewer rights than what we would kind of call commoners, who are basically like ordinary like subjects. Serfs they couldn't be bought or sold, and they weren't considered chattel. In other words, they weren't considered objects. But that being said, they didn't own property. All property was owned by the local lord. And in order to do things like leave the estate or get married, they had to have the permission of the Lord. So manorialism is based on the idea of reciprocal obligations, an important distinction, especially if you guys are interested in eventually, hopefully, getting a job and signing an employment agreement. Just because you have an agreement and there is reciprocity in that agreement, that does not necessarily mean that the reciprocity is equal. You can decide whether this is equal or not. So you have a lord that owns a bunch of land. So in exchange for the right to grow food on that land, or doesn't have to be food, I guess it could be, let's just say crops. The peasant had to give a portion of their produce to the lord, and the lord is supposed to also provide them some basic protection. Now, oftentimes these manors, one, level of productivity was low, technology was pretty limited, and to be honest, you don't really see technology advance beyond what the Roman Empire had until around the 10th and 11th century CE. So really on these manors, basically the economy was more or less self-sufficient. Basically anything that a lord or the manor would need was going to be grown or produced on the manor. So a manor might have a blacksmith. A manor might have a stable. A manor is going to have most things that, a medieval agrarian economy is going to need. But it's not very efficient. And because of that, because of this shift towards manors throughout Europe, you don't have a lot of trade. And so that also means that you don't even see a whole lot of coinage during this time period. A lot of it is just a barter economy. And of course, the foundation of that economy is agriculture. Now, you can imagine a lot of the weaknesses. So this is a common form of organization until these guys come in. So they're isolated. They're usually fairly small, and they are really too small to protect themselves, but just large enough to really irritate a would-be conqueror or raider. And you don't really have much in the way of strong centralized governments, especially immediately after the collapse of the Roman Empire. There you still have political organizations that are almost tribal or based on family systems. You don't really see much in the way of a strong centralized government. Here is, sorry, my face is in the way, a diagram or overview of a medieval manor. I feel like this is a little false advertising. You wouldn't see a castle like that until well into like the end of the Middle Ages. Basically, a manor is going to be a structure probably with more than one room. It's not going to be that impressive. It's not going to be all that fortified either. It's just going to be a house that is larger than the average. So, that all gets sort of screwed up with the advent of the Viking invasions. So, little note about the Vikings. The Vikings, that's a term that we sort of use to describe raiders from Scandinavia, Northern Europe in general. They don't come from any one country. Some of them come from Northern Germany, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, probably as far away in some cases maybe as Finland. I'm not sure about that. But they begin to come in during the 9th century. And Western European, well, the issue with the Vikings is that, they're not a normal field army that you can see coming from maybe a couple hundred miles away, that you can easily warn people about, that kind of thing. The Viking longships are very small, highly maneuverable, and they're basically ninja boats. They can appear off coastlines, rapidly drop off raiders, or even basically sail upstream, upriver, and attack cities along the way. What the Vikings really like to do is they like to attack medieval monasteries that tended to have lots of precious artifacts and, jewelry, that sort of thing. So the issue is that, the protection provided by manors might be helpful for taking out the local brigands and robbers, that kind of thing. But against the Vikings, where suddenly you could have a couple of hundred raiders just appear out of nowhere, that just wasn't going to cut it. So you see Western Europeans start to adopt an even more sophisticated level of organization, which is going to come from the top down. So the idea here is that we're going to extend that system of reciprocal obligations that we see in manorialism, but we're going to add a few obligations, and we're going to basically apply this not just to lords and peasants, but we're going to apply it to everybody. So the idea in feudalism is, yes, you still have that same relationship between nobles and peasants, but those nobles and peasants, nobles, they are going to pledge themselves to a national sovereign, a king. The nobles themselves, they're going to need more military protection, and so their retainers, their peeps, they become knights. And the knights, they're basically going to keep the peasants in line. Now, the other thing is that peasants were also expected to provide. Why is there an S down here? That's gross looking. Ha. The peasants could potentially be sort of drafted into a local militia or military. And oftentimes, these feudal agreements required peasants to serve a certain amount of time in the army of the local lord. Now, on the one hand, this gives a lot of military muscle to local lords to resist the Vikings. By the way, this also corresponds with fortifying these manors, and this is where you begin to see the first castles. At first, they're kind of unimpressive. They're these wooden buildings with maybe a ditch dug around them, but later on, they become much more ornate and ostentatious. Bougie castles. The issue, though, is once you give somebody power, it's hard to ask for it back. So this works by giving local lords a substantial amount of military power. This was kind of the solution in some respects that the Roman Empire adopts when it becomes an empire. Remember, it basically gives power to a lot of military commanders. And remember, oftentimes those military commanders use their newfound power and authority against the central government. So, once you empower these nobles, they start developing their own power base. And we see some fairly dramatic consequences. Like, for example, when monarchs start to grow in power, oftentimes they come into conflict with a lot of their local lords and the local aristocracy. So let's take a look at the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta is kind of seen as an accomplishment of English proto-democracy. We sort of glamorize it, and we see it as kind of a predecessor to our Constitution, which it certainly is. We also see it, it also enshrines certain rights and privileges that we recognize in our Constitution. Like, for example, the idea of no taxation without representation, the right to a jury trial, in a jury tried or a jury, a trial that is conducted by a jury of your peers. Due process rights, the idea that in order for the state to take your stuff, there has to be some level of due process involved. Like, all of this stuff comes from the Magna Carta, but context is everything in history. So what happens is, of course, King John of England starts to levy lots of taxes on the aristocracy, and he was just being a bro. I mean that literally. His brother, Richard the Lionheart, had gotten himself captured coming back from the Crusades, and John was having to levy tons of taxes in order to pay the ransom. Well, ironically, what happens is, in an effort to basically solve this Liam Neeson Taken kidnapping crisis, John himself gets kidnapped by English barons that rise up against John at Runnymede. John is basically forced at sword point to sign this document called the Great Charter, Magna Carta, which gives away basically some royal power to the aristocracy. So we have this concept of no taxation without representation. In other words, if taxes are going to be levied in England, it has to be by the consent of the governed, or by the consent of the lords, the aristocracy. So in 1265, we have the creation of a body that is supposed to provide that. This is, of course, the English Parliament. Right now, Parliament's powers mostly revolve around taxation, basically crafting a budget. That's still, by the way, Parliament's main power today in the United Kingdom. But eventually, those taxing and spending powers will make Parliament not just the body that grants consent to be taxed, but also it will eventually make Parliament the sovereign body of government for the UK in a few hundred years. Now, there are basically three estates, three classes, if you like. You have the church, you have the nobles, and you have the commoners. And your legal rights were basically determined by which estate that you were born into. And in many cases, you can think of commoners as, again, being a little bit more than serfs. So commoners, this would be somebody who has their own property, who isn't beholden to a lord necessarily. They just don't have a title of nobility. Increasingly, that's how commoners are going to be referred to. So there is sort of a differentiation between commoners and serfs. So anyway, what happens is that despite the fact that you have very powerful feudal lords during this time period, you do see the emergence of strong centralized governments in places like England and France, especially because of wartime. You know, the primary function of the king, and it is mostly kings in the Middle Ages, is to raise national armies that can defend the kingdom or conquer more stuff for the kingdom. And so if you have a war that lasts 100 years, that leads to a consolidation of power in what we call the crown. The development of strong monarchies, though, it takes a while. Manors are slowly absorbed into kingdoms, and vassals slowly but surely pledge their loyalty to the crown, wherever or whoever the crown was being utilized by. So an example that's given at the slide is you have William the Conqueror, who, before he was King of England, is Duke of Normandy. He introduced feudalism to England following his invasion of England in 1066. He wins the Battle of Hastings, and he declares that vassals must swear allegiance to him personally, not to other lords. But William the Conqueror also showcases the complexity of feudalism. So William the Conqueror is Duke of Normandy. Normandy is a region of France, a very productive region. So a little bit of info on the Normans. If you're a Star Wars fan, think of the Normans as like the medieval version of the Mandalorians, or think of them as sort of like the Spartans. The Normans were incredibly martial and very good at fighting. So the Normans, though, are not actually French in origin. So the Kingdom of France suffered tons of, damage because of Viking raids starting in the 9th to 10th century CE. As a result of those raids, the French monarchy decided, in sort of a bout of inspiration, that maybe the best way to fight Vikings is with other Vikings. So the region of Normandy was heavily raided and pillaged by the Vikings. And so the King of France asks this chap by the name of Rollo to defend the French coastline from invasion, and in return, he will be able to take his Norsemen and settle in France, where the climate's a lot better. Normandy is a very rich region of France, so it's a win-win for everybody. But things go off the rails pretty quickly. So theoretically, with feudalism, the local lords are supposed to serve the king, right? And oftentimes this would take the form of these very elaborate ceremonies of homage, where basically you publicly swear loyalty to the king. So Rollo goes to the king, and he's supposed to swear homage, fealty, by kissing the king's feet. So the king is, sitting on his chair, feeling, pretty proud of himself, because this is the equivalent of this nerdy, geeky little king, who's going to be sucked up to by like this big hulking Viking warlord. So Rollo comes up, looks at this little king seated on his throne with his feet waiting to be kissed. Rollo promptly picks up the king's feet, kisses them, and of course the effect, though, is that the king topples out of his chair. Rollo's like, whoopsie, tee-hee. This demonstrates that the Normans were kind of clever. So Normandy basically becomes its own self-governing state within the French state. So William the Conqueror has a claim to the throne of England. He invades in 1066. He defeats the native Anglo-Saxon defenders, who were more of like a Germanic group of people. And he declares himself King of England. Awkwardly, he is King of England, Duke of Normandy, and he still has a feudal obligation to the King of France. And that doesn't go away. In fact, the 100 Years' War, which is fought between England and France, during that entire conflict, the King of England was technically a vassal of the King of France, even though the King of England was more often than not more personally powerful and wealthy than the King of France. Go figure. Feudalism is incredibly complicated. The other thing I will mention here, of course, is that with the invasion of England in 1066, the fusion of the French language, spoken by French Vikings, the Normans, and the local Germanic dialects of England creates eventually the modern English language, which has mostly French vocabulary as well as German sentence structure. In my opinion, the worst of both worlds. So I got a little ahead of myself and talked about the Vikings before I really needed to, almost like I had Viking expeditiousness myself. So yes, we talked about the fact that they were Danish, Norwegian, Swedish. These raids lasted for a while. The causes generally are considered to be the fact that this area of Europe was not particularly productive agriculturally. This is a part where there's pretty significant global cooling going on. And so the Vikings, a lot of these Vikings were basically like a lot of them aren't even warriors. A lot of them are just like almost middle class people who are trying to supplement their income. So today, if you need a side gig, side hustle, you drive an Uber. In the 8th century, 9th century CE, well, you got on a long ship and you started, taking a battle axe to a bunch of Gregorian monks. It's basically the same thing. Arguably, another component to this is the fact that, for the most part, the Vikings were still religiously distinct from the rest of Europe. They practiced this Norse Germanic polytheistic religion, as displayed by Marvel's Thor, in which, among other things, they believed that you were only going to enter the good afterlife, Valhalla, if you fall in battle. And so, arguably, this meant that the Vikings had to find conflict and that sort of thing. We've talked about the boats. We've talked about the raids. Eventually, what happens is by about the 9th, 10th century CE, the population of Scandinavia slowly but surely begins to convert to Christianity. And interestingly, in Viking myths, you begin to actually see that. As famously in Viking mythology, you have Ragnarök, which is supposed to be the battle sort of at the end of the world, and gradually you start to see Christian mythology sort of being infused into it. And in some cases, I've even heard, and I'm not 100% sure on this, in some versions of the myth, like there's supposed to be the arrival of new gods, and this is supposed to be the bridge from Viking polytheism to Christianity. Oh, and these are the Europeans that discovered North America. Except, problem is the Vikings were sort of secretive. They didn't like people knowing about where they set up shop. The other thing is that the Viking language doesn't use the Latin script. They don't use like A, B, C, D, etc. They use runic script that basically nobody could read until the 18th century. And so that discovery basically is kept on the DL because of that. So we're going out of sequence a little bit because what's on this slide, really happens before the emergence of feudalism. But really, if you want to know sort of, well, I'll just be blunt. Basically, the history of the Middle Ages is in large part the history of France. So we have to talk about the Franks, who are a Germanic tribe that migrates along with the Goths and the Huns and basically all of these other people who are uprooted for various reasons. So the Franks bring in a Germanic language. And the native people of France, of course, by this time are fairly Romanized. They speak Latin, or basically a Latin dialect. So the first king of the Franks was this guy by the name of Clovis, and he creates what we call the Merovingian dynasty. But interestingly, like the Merovingians, they start to lose power pretty rapidly. And by about the 700s, real power was held by the king's officials, particularly this position called the mayor of the palace. In 732, the mayor of the palace was Charles Martel, which means Charles the Hammer, which is like would be a sick frontman for a metal band. Any hoodles. So this is during the time period where Islam is just kicking butt and taking names everywhere. This is that time period where they conquer North Africa, cross the Straits of Gibraltar into Spain, and now they're even making their way up into France. So they just seemed unstoppable. And so Charles Martel rallies the Frankish army. The Franks are, had this warrior culture. They're very heavily armored by the standards of the day, and they just clobber the Muslim advance into Western Europe. So this is the Battle of Tours. Some historians consider this one of the most decisive and important battles in all of history. It kind of depends upon what you think the Muslims were trying to do. I've heard some people say that it was basically just, a raid. Other people say that no, had the Muslims succeeded, they would have even conquered France. So after the Battle of Tours, our boy Charles the Hammer's got a little street cred, and so he basically fires the King of France, who says, "Yes, thank you, sir, can I have another?" The King of France was the only official who had had permission to wear his hair long. Charles Martel, in maybe a little bit of peevishness, orders the king's hair to be cut, and Charles Martel founds what we call the Carolingian dynasty. Okay, now, Charles Martel's grandson is Charlemagne, which basically means Charles the Great. So Charlemagne basically continues what his grandfather starts, and he takes the kingdom of the Franks and transforms it into an empire that almost rivals that of the Roman Empire. So, in fact, actually, he's so successful that the Pope crowns Charlemagne as the first Holy Roman Emperor. That's kind of disputed by some historians, but at the very least, he is crowned Emperor of the Romans. So this also sets the precedent that the power of the church is like foundational and essential to legitimize the power of the king. That Caesaropapism problem in Eastern Europe and the Eastern Empire? Well, we're going to have a very different kind of relationship in the West. Anyway, Charlemagne has this massive empire that controls parts of northern Spain, all of France, parts of the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, northern Italy. So a lot of the old Western Roman Empire. The slide doesn't really go into it that much, but Charlemagne also inaugurates this period called the Carolingian Renaissance, this period where the Dark Ages are less dark, where you begin to see the reemergence of an urban sort of lifestyle centered around the city of Aachen, which is like smack dab in the middle of Germany and France. It's also where you begin to see the emergence of education in Europe. And so it seems like things are going a lot better. Charlemagne, however, is ultimately defeated, not by any foreign enemy, but instead by the dude's kids. Great people always have sucky kids. So when Charlemagne dies, his empire is split between his three sons. He was able to conquer the Saxons, the Lombards, the Frisians. He conquers everybody. He's unable to conquer, however, France's inheritance laws. So his kingdom is split equally with the Treaty of Verdun. This might be one of the most important treaties in, certainly in European history, but also in world history, because it basically sets the groundwork for the modern day states of France, to a certain extent Italy and the Low Countries, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, but definitely Germany. So the irony of everything, of course, is that the two countries that will define the 20th century with two world wars. I mean, a lot of World War I is really a war most directly between France and Germany. Ironically, they're kind of like brothers. So, again, the Franks are a Germanic people, but the throne, the kingdom is split by the Treaty of Verdun. Okay, so with the death of Charlemagne, the title Holy Roman Emperor kind of goes into abeyance. In other words, it kind of goes away for a little bit. It's revived by Otto I, who is crowned the Holy Roman Emperor. Voltaire famously says that the Holy Roman Empire is neither holy nor Roman nor much of an empire. That's definitely true later on in its history. But for right now, the Holy Roman Empire is actually not. It's more powerful than you would think, especially in the Middle Ages. So the Holy Roman Empire consist of most of Germany, parts of France, northern Italy, and eventually will consist of Austria and territories further into the east. So from this point onward, the Holy Roman Empire lasts from 962 to 1806. However, the things that we associate with the Holy Roman Empire, or with the Roman Empire, a strong centralized government, that doesn't really apply. So, Holy Roman Emperors are elected by basically a council of nobles. Now, eventually, by the time of the 14 and 1500s, what's going to happen is that the Dukes of Austria, which that duchy is ruled over by the House of Habsburg. The Habsburgs will basically be the Holy Roman Emperors from the 1400s up until the 1800s, when the title is formally dissolved. But again, it lasts for a very long time. It's not a Roman Empire like the actual Roman Empire. Is very feudalistic, and again is very multinational. It unifies German, Italian, French, Austrian, all of these different nationalities together. But again, it lasts a very long time. It's only dissolved by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1806. And theoretically, I mean, one of the things that happens shortly thereafter is the establishment of Germany and Italy as their own nation states. So this Holy Roman Empire, it also kind of prevents the establishment of countries like France or England, where these are states with a more homogenous national culture where that speaks a more homogenous language. You don't have that in the Holy Roman Empire. So, that is the Dark Ages. The ironic thing, of course, is that towards the end of this period, we begin to see the light at the end of the tunnel with Charlemagne, and then the Vikings come, and of course, Charlemagne kicks the bucket, and basically that European unity that we see briefly fades away. We will pick back up with the High Middle Ages next time.